50 wooden boxes, rotting at the bottom and stinking of dead brood, were shoved over the property line before dawn. It wasn't a mistake. It was garbage disposal. They thought she'd burned them. Instead, she put on a pair of heavy leather gloves and cracked the first lid open. Maggie heard the flatbed truck long before the sun crested the eastern ridge. It was the heavy, grinding whine of a diesel engine straining in low gear, a sound that didn't belong on the washed-out county road bordering her north pasture. The truck stopped. It idled for 10 minutes in the pre-dawn dark. Then, with a harsh crunch of gears, it sped off, leaving a plume of black exhaust hanging in the still, damp air. By the time she pulled her duct-taped boots on and drove the rusted four-wheeler through the wet morning grass, the dust had settled. The fence line was ruined. 3 strands of barbed wire, stretched taut just last spring, were snapped and trampled into the mud. And there, sitting on her side of the property line, was a sprawling pile of garbage. At least it looked like garbage. Maggie cut the four-wheeler's engine. The silence of the morning rushed back in, save for the cooling tick of the motor. She walked closer, the dew soaking through the knees of her denim work pants. There were dozens of them. Stacked haphazardly, some tumbled over onto their sides, spilling frames of black, brittle wax onto the dirt. Langstroth bee boxes. The paint was peeling, the wood warped and soft with rot at the corners. Commercial pollination outfits churned through equipment like a sawmill churns through pine, and these were the casualties. She knew exactly where they came from. Miller Ag Innovations. Roy Miller ran thousands of hives across the state, chasing the bloom from the almond orchards down south all the way up to the local cherry crops. When his hives grew diseased, weak, or infested with mites, he didn't waste labor nursing them. He culled them. And apparently, paying disposal fees at the county dump was too much of a hit to his profit margins. Burning them on his own property required a commercial fire permit and an environmental inspection. Dumping them on the failing, debt-ridden property of a neighbor who couldn't afford a lawyer. That was free. Maggie stood with her hands on her hips, her breath pluming in the cold air. The sheer arrogance of it made a hard, hot knot tighten in her chest. She looked at the sprawling Miller estate in the distance, the pristine white silos gleaming as the first rays of sunlight hit them. Then she looked down at the rotting wood at her feet. She walked up to the nearest box. A foul, sour smell wafted from the entrance reducer. Dead bees littered the bottom board, a crust of discarded life. She kicked the side of the box with the toe of her boot, fully intending to drive back to the barn, fetch a can of diesel, and strike a match. Let Roy deal with the smoke blowing over his pristine acreage. But a sound stopped her. It wasn't a hum. It was a faint, disjointed crackle. Maggie knelt in the mud. She reached down, her bare fingers slipping under the cold rim of the telescoping cover, and pulled it back. The inner cover was sealed tight with propolis, nature's glue. She walked back to the four-wheeler, grabbed a rusted tire iron from the toolbox, and wedged it between the wooden seams. She leaned her weight into it. The wood groaned, cracked, and gave way. Inside, it was a massacre. Wax moths had spun grey, sticky webs across the outer frames. Small hive beetles scurried away from the sudden influx of light. But right in the center, bridging 3 frames of dark comb, was a cluster of life. Perhaps 300 bees, a pitiful fraction of a healthy colony. They were shivering, vibrating their flight muscles to generate heat, huddled around a single queen. They were starving. Maggie stared at them. They didn't fly up to attack her. They didn't have the energy. They just clung to the wax, vibrating, dying in the cold. She was $50,000 in debt. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the land her grandfather had broken his back to clear. Her tractor needed a new transmission, her roof leaked into the kitchen sink, and the soil was too tired to yield a decent crop of winter wheat. She was, in every measurable way, exactly like the insects inside this rotting box, discarded, left to freeze, written off by the people with the big trucks and the white silos. Maggie dropped the tire iron. She didn't light a match. Instead, she backed the four-wheeler up to the pile. She wrestled the first heavy, awkward box onto the rear rack. Mud smeared across her jacket. Splinters bit into her palms. It took her 4 hours and 7 trips to move all 42 boxes into the shelter of her dilapidated pole barn. Her back screamed, her knuckles bled, but she didn't stop until the fence line was entirely clear. She wasn't going to let them die, if only to spite Roy Miller. The local farm supply co-op was a place where information traded hands faster than currency. Maggie usually kept her head down, buying only what she absolutely needed and getting out before the idle gossip could hook her. On Tuesday, she walked up to the counter and dropped 4 50-pound bags of granulated cane sugar onto the concrete floor with a heavy thud. The clerk, a teenager named Toby, blinked behind the register. "Baking a lot of pies, Maggie?" "Something like that," she muttered, sliding a worn debit card across the counter. She prayed the transaction would clear. It did. She loaded the 200 pounds of sugar into the bed of her truck and drove home. Beekeeping, she learned entirely by trial and error, was not a gentle hobby. It was a brutal, sticky, physically demanding science. She didn't have a pristine white suit. She couldn't afford one. She bought a cheap mesh veil that fit over a wide-brimmed hat, wrapped duct tape around the cuffs of her jeans, and wore heavy leather work gloves that made her fingers clumsy. The first week was triage. She dragged a folding table into the barn and began dismantling the boxes one by one. The smell was awful, a mix of fermentation, rot, and death. She scraped away the wax mothwebs with a putty knife. She tossed the mouldy frames onto a burn pile. She boiled water on her kitchen stove, mixing it 1-to-1 with the sugar, carrying heavy 5-gallon buckets out to the barn. She poured the syrup into Ziploc bags, scored the plastic with a razor blade, and laid them directly over the surviving clusters of bees. They were starving, but they were also defensive. As the sugar revived them, their energy returned, and with energy came the stingers. She took her first sting on the wrist, right where the glove met the sleeve of her jacket. It felt like a lit match being driven into her skin. She flinched, dropped a frame, and crushed a dozen bees. The pheromones released by the crushed workers sent a chemical alarm through the air, smelling faintly of artificial bananas. Instantly, the rest of the hive turned on her. 3 more stings hit her shoulder. One found a gap in her veil and nailed her right on the cheekbone. Maggie stumbled out of the barn, ripping the veil off, her heart hammering in her chest. She sat on the wet grass, clutching her face as the venom pumped a hot, throbbing ache through her jaw. By evening, her right eye was swollen completely shut. The skin was tight, shiny, and burning. She held a bag of frozen peas to her face, staring at her deformed reflection in the dark kitchen window. "This is stupid," she thought. "They are bugs. You are going into debt for bugs." But the next morning, when the swelling had subsided to a dull, bruised ache, she put the veil back on and went out to the barn. She consolidated. She couldn't save 42 hives. Most didn't have a queen, or the cluster was simply too small to maintain brood temperature. Following the advice of pixelated, decade-old forum posts she scrolled through on her dial-up internet, she used newspaper to combine the weak colonies. She placed a single sheet of newsprint between 2 boxes, poking small holes in the paper. By the time the bees chewed through the paper to reach each other, their scents would mingle, and they wouldn't fight. Out of 42 dead outs, She built 14 viable, struggling colonies. Spring broke late and wet. The maple trees lining the creek bed burst into tiny reddish blooms, and the dandelions pushed through the pasture grass. Maggie moved the 14 hives out of the barn and set them on wooden pallets facing the morning sun. She watched them. For the first time in years, she stood still and just watched. The workers began returning with heavy yellow bundles of pollen packed onto their hind legs. They were flying with purpose. The sugar syrup had kept them alive, but the fresh pollen meant they were feeding brood. They were raising the next generation. They had decided to live. Her routine shifted. It was no longer just about survival. It was about management. She learned to read the frames. She learned the difference between the flat, biscuity cappings of worker brood and the bullet-shaped bumps of drone cells. She learned to spot the queen, longer, sleeker, moving with a deliberate grace through the chaotic throng of her daughters. Late in May, she had to go into town for tractor parts. She walked into the local diner to grab a black coffee. Her hands were stained with propolis, a sticky, resinous rust color that never fully washed out of the skin creases. She had a fresh sting on her neck, a red welt creeping above her collar. Roy Miller was sitting in the corner booth with 2 of his foremen. He was a big man who wore expensive, spotless boots and a silver belt buckle. He caught sight of Maggie, his eyes lingering on the welt on her neck and the dirt on her knees. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "Here you've got a bit of a pest problem out your way, Maggie. Skunks getting into the garbage?" The foreman chuckled. Maggie walked up to the counter. She didn't look at him. She paid for her coffee, took a slow sip, and turned around. "No skunks, Roy," she said, her voice flat, carrying easily across the quiet diner. "Just some trash the neighbors left out. Figured I'd clean it up since they didn't have the spine to do it themselves." The diner went dead silent. Roy's smile vanished. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under his heavy skin. He looked like he wanted to stand up, but Maggie just turned her back on him and walked out the door, the bell chiming cheerfully in her wake. By July, the blackberry brambles that choked the county ditches were in full, aggressive bloom. The nectar flow hit like a tidal wave. Maggie's 14 hives exploded. The clusters that had once barely covered 3 frames now boiled over, filling 2 deep boxes and pushing up into the honey supers she had scavenged and repaired. The sound of the hives changed. It was no longer a desperate, high-pitched whine. It was a deep, resonant roar. The sound of tens of thousands of wings dehydrating nectar into honey. She pulled the first frame on a hot Tuesday afternoon. She used a stainless steel hive tool to pry the frame loose, the propolis snapping loudly in the heat. As she lifted it out of the box, her breath caught. It was heavy, easily 7 or 8 pounds. The wax was drawn out perfectly, edge to edge, capped with a layer of pristine, snow-white wax. Underneath that wax was pure, wild blackberry honey. The sunlight caught it, turning the frame into a solid brick of translucent amber. Maggie slipped a gloved finger under the wax capping and broke the seal. A thick, viscous bead of honey welled up. She pulled off her glove, dipped her bare finger into it, and tasted it. It was impossibly sweet, with a sharp, bright, floral finish that tasted exactly like the hot summer air. It didn't taste like struggle. It didn't taste like the mud, or the freezing barn, or the venom that had swollen her eyes shut. It tasted like capital. It tasted like a way out. Maggie needed an extractor. The honey supers were stacked 4 high on the strongest pallets, bowing the wood beneath them. The frames were fully capped, heavy with summer nectar, but without a centrifuge to spin the honey from the wax, it was useless. Commercial extractors cost thousands of dollars. She had $42 in her checking account, She walked the property perimeter, boots sinking into the dry August dirt. Behind the collapsed timber of the old tractor shed, a patch of overgrown blackberry bushes hid the entrance to her grandfather's storm cellar. It was a Cold War relic, a reinforced concrete bunker buried into the hillside, forgotten for 3 decades. Maggie grabbed a machete from the barn and spent 2 hours hacking through the thorns. She found the rusted steel door. The hinges shrieked as she threw her weight against it, breaking the seal. Stale, cool air rushed out. She clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight and stepped down into the dark. The air inside was perfectly dry. The concrete walls were uncracked, and in the center of the room, draped under a heavy canvas tarp, was a cylindrical shape. Maggie pulled the canvas back. Dust plumed into the beam of her flashlight. It was a commercial-grade, 20-frame radial honey extractor, built of heavy-gauge stainless steel. Beside it were uncapping knives, stainless steel settling tanks, and boxes of untouched glass jars. Her grandfather hadn't just dabbled in beekeeping. He had prepared for a commercial operation right before his heart gave out. It was a hidden inheritance, a complete, functioning processing facility buried beneath the dirt. Maggie went to work. She didn't just clean the bunker, she sterilized it. She hauled buckets of bleach water down the steps, scrubbing the concrete walls until the air burned her lungs. She laid down heavy-duty white plastic sheeting across the floor. She dismantled the extractor, boiling every stainless steel bearing, every valve, every screen. She treated the space like a surgical theater. When she finally brought the first stacks of honey supers down into the cool, subterranean room, she wore fresh white coveralls and blue nitrile gloves. The ambient temperature in the bunker was a consistent 65 degrees, perfect for handling wax. The extraction began. It was a clinical, meticulous process. She took the first frame. The hot uncapping knife slid beneath the wax seal, peeling away the cappings in a single, perfectly straight ribbon. The exposed honey gleamed, thick and golden. She loaded the frames into the radial drum. When the drum was full, she flipped the heavy analog switch. The electric motor, wired into the barn's main breaker, hummed to life. The drum spun. Centrifugal force ripped the honey from the hexagonal cells. It slammed against the stainless steel walls of the extractor, pooling at the bottom, before flowing out the heavy brass gate valve. Maggie placed a fine mesh sieve over a 5-gallon bucket. The honey poured through in a thick, continuous ribbon. It was pure. It was perfect. By midnight, her shoulders burned, her hands cramped, but the bunker was lined with 15 white buckets, 900 pounds of raw, unfiltered blackberry honey. She didn't stop there. The triage protocols she had established in the spring carried over to the harvest. She separated the honey by the specific nectar flows. The early spring dandelion and maple honey was light and sharp. The midsummer blackberry was deep and rich. She collected the propolis, the sticky, resinous substance the bees use to seal the hives, and began soaking it in high-proof grain alcohol, creating a potent antibacterial tincture. She bottled it in small amber dropper bottles with clinical, minimalist labels. She was operating a high-stakes emergency ward for insects, and the byproducts were medical grade. She loaded her truck and drove to the city. Not the local farmers' market where people haggled over 50 cents, but the high-end culinary district. She walked into the kitchens of restaurants that charged $80 for a steak. She didn't offer a sales pitch. She placed a single sterile glass jar on the stainless steel prep counters, unscrewed the lid, and handed the head chefs a tasting spoon. The flavor did the talking. The complexity of the local forage, completely unadulterated by heat or microfiltration, was a revelation. By the end of September, Maggie had exclusive supply contracts with 6 restaurants. They were paying premium retail prices for bulk wholesale quantities. The bank called, threatening to finalize the foreclosure. Maggie walked into the branch manager's office, wearing her mud-stained boots and a clean denim shirt. She dropped a cashier's check on his desk that cleared her entire arrears, with enough left over to replace the tractor transmission. By year 3, the 14 salvaged hives had multiplied into 300 robust colonies. The bunker was entirely retrofitted, with commercial dehumidifiers and automated bottling lines. Her branding remained clean and austere. It featured only the company name, the batch number, and the specific floral source. The local agricultural landscape, however, was quietly dying. Roy Miller was finally running his massive operation into the ground. His heavy reliance on imported, highly stressed package bees had caught up with him. His brutal culling practices meant he ignored the early warning signs. A virulent strain of European foul brood ripped through his yards. Because he routinely neglected basic hygienic triage and refused to practice isolation, the bacterial infection spread unchecked across his holdings. By early spring, exactly 3 weeks before the highly lucrative orchard pollination contracts were due to begin, 80% of his hives were completely dead. The fields were silent. The major almond growers down south were panicking. If the fragile blossoms were not pollinated within a strict 2-week window, the entire crop would fail. The agricultural ripple effect would be financially devastating. Maggie was deep in the bunker, running a fresh batch of propolis tincture through a sterile filter. She heard heavy footsteps echoing loudly on the exterior concrete stairs. She did not look up from her workstation. The air pressure shifted dramatically as the reinforced steel door groaned open. Roy Miller stood awkwardly in the narrow doorway. He looked significantly smaller than she remembered. The usual arrogant posture was entirely gone. His expensive leather boots were heavily scuffed, and his face appeared pale and deeply drawn. He looked around the pristine, brightly lit extraction room. His wide eyes took in the gleaming stainless steel tanks and the surgical cleanliness of the underground operation. He swallowed very hard once. "Maggie," he said, his voice sounding tight and unfamiliar. She finished tightening the black cap on a small amber bottle. She placed it deliberately on the drying rack, stripped off her blue nitrile gloves, and threw them straight into a red biohazard bin. "You are tracking outside dirt into my clean room, Roy," she stated calmly. He stepped backward, wiping his boots awkwardly on the metal threshold. "I need bees," he blurted out. "I need 300 strong hives, ready for transport by tomorrow night. The orchard contracts are currently calling in their guarantees right now. I am simply defaulting." Maggie leaned heavily against the cold stainless steel settling tank. She crossed her arms across her chest and stared at him. "That sounds like a severe operational failure on your end." "I will pay you," Roy pleaded, pure desperation cracking his normally booming voice. "I will pay double the standard going rate for commercial pollination leases. I just need your healthy hives loaded onto my flatbed trucks." Maggie looked closely at his face. She remembered the bitterly cold morning, the stinking, rotting wooden boxes dumped completely unceremoniously on her wet property line before the morning sun had ever fully risen. She vividly remembered the freezing, starving clusters of fragile life he had casually thrown away, merely to save a minor county disposal fee. She did not feel any sudden flash of hot anger. Anger was a completely useless, inherently chaotic emotion that served no purpose here. Instead, she felt only the cold, detached precision of a seasoned trauma surgeon successfully diagnosing a terminal, completely irreversible bodily condition. "No," Maggie said very flatly, her tone devoid of all sympathy. Roy simply stared at her, blinking his tired eyes in shock. "I am offering you exactly $60,000 in cash today. That is for a simple 3-week lease arrangement. You literally cannot afford to refuse that kind of money." "I actually just did," Maggie replied without hesitation. She walked slowly over to the deep stainless steel sink and began scrubbing her bare hands with heavy-duty pumice soap. Your remaining equipment is entirely contaminated. Your holding yards are an active biological hazard. If I put my perfectly healthy, isolated colonies onto your dirty trucks, they will inevitably bring back deadly mites, virulent foul brood, and God only knows exactly what else. You do not have a temporary livestock shortage, Roy Miller. You have a massive systemic infection. The host organism is completely dead. If I am forced to default on these major contracts, the central bank will immediately seize all my heavy equipment, he said, his voice suddenly dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. I will lose the entire family farm. Maggie calmly grabbed a rough paper towel and thoroughly dried her clean hands. She tossed the damp towel squarely into the grey waste bin nearby. Then you truly should have bothered to learn how to properly manage your livestock, instead of treating living creatures like nothing but purely disposable garbage. She turned her back firmly on him and picked up a fresh pair of thick blue gloves from the supply box. Please close the heavy steel door securely on your way out. You are currently ruining my precise climate control. Roy stood there silently for a long, utterly agonizing moment. The heavy silence in the underground bunker was palpable, broken only by the low, steady hum of the commercial dehumidifier in the far corner. Finally, he turned it around and walked slowly up the concrete stairs. The heavy steel door clicked shut loudly, sealing the hidden bunker perfectly tight once again. Maggie immediately went right back to her meticulous extraction work without another single thought. By the absolute end of the current month, Miller Ag Innovations officially filed for immediate Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The vast commercial orchard growers, suddenly desperate for highly reliable almond pollination, approached Maggie directly. She certainly did not accept all of their frantic offers. She ruthlessly selected only the specific farms that utilized highly responsible pesticide practices and consistently offered the very best floral forage for her insects. She firmly dictated all the strict financial terms. She retained absolute control over the massive new agricultural contracts. She no longer merely sold jars of sweet blackberry honey. She aggressively sold a specialized, elite agricultural pollination service. When her accountant finally handed her the end-of-year tax filings, the gross valuation of the business sat squarely at $412,000. Maggie quietly took the heavy paperwork and walked slowly outside. The north pasture fence line was perfectly repaired. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the green grass. In the distance, the steady roar of 300 healthy hives hummed loudly in the evening air. It sounded exactly like beautiful, relentless, absolute survival. The story of those discarded hives proves that true value isn't always obvious. Sometimes, the very things others throw away are exactly what you need to build an empire. If Maggie's journey from a ruined fence line to a booming business inspired you today, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good comeback story. And subscribe to our channel for more incredible, real-life tales of grit, resilience, and sweet revenge.